I'm pleasantly surprised that there are so many people here. I wasn't expecting such a large audience for a dry session on scientific research. That's very encouraging. What's that? What? Yeah, I should just speak myself. Okay, my name's Michael Gurdon. I'm and it will be my pleasure to introduce Professor Doug Kruse, who's going to be the main presenter here. My role is as moderator, and I will take questions, and where there aren't enough questions, perhaps I'll have my own. But my role is also to provide some historical context to the more contemporary references to recent studies in the field of employee ownership that Doug is going to cover. And some of my observations flow from my own research as a doctoral candidate at Cornell University some 40 years ago. So I hope that this will be a useful backdrop from those early studies leading into the current research practice. Now, my first degree actually was in history, so I can't help myself. I just have to do this. If you look at the historical record in the United States, you can go back to at least 1847, when 20 members of a Cincinnati union of iron molders formed a joint stock company following an unsuccessful strike. So there's a very long history of employees forming a new type of organization, a new model of organization to survive, to take the initiative in pursuing their work. And it's also true that with economic cycles, there were rises in producer cooperatives and declines in producer cooperatives over time. But I have to say, in fairness, that when I got back into graduate studies in the 1970s, the greatest excitement in the literature seemed to be from international sources. The producer cooperative networks in Mondragon, Spain, as one example, or the self-management system in the former Yugoslavia as another example of what was being written about as innovative and radical programs in the literature. So I arrive at Cornell in 1975, and very soon after, under the direction of the eminent sociologist William Foote White, a small team of researchers at Cornell began to study in closer detail a new phenomenon that was appearing in North America and especially in the northeast of the United States. In the recession of that period, many conglomerates were starting to put up for sale or closing down divisions and plants that they viewed as superfluous or unprofitable. So graduate students were assigned or selected to study specific cases of these buyouts. For example, a trucking firm in Alberta, Canada, a library furniture maker in Herkimer, New York, a knitting mill in Saratoga Springs, even an asbestos mine in Lowell, Vermont. All of these were examples at that time, in the mid-1970s, of workers and managers and sometimes community members who sought to save their firm within their communities. I personally focused on the knitting mill in Saratoga Springs, and I studied it over a more than 2-year period in research that became my doctoral dissertation. Now, in that particular case, the mill shutdown would have cost the remaining 80 workers their jobs, and all of the spillover community effects, negative effects of that loss. Yet the then senior executive understood that that facility, that mill, was profitable. Now, it might not have been, and probably wasn't, meeting the minimum return on investment objective or goal that corporate management had set, but it was still making money. And it would have been a waste of resources and a loss, obviously, of jobs if it had been shut down. That manager who became the president of the new employee-owned company was, by the way, very politically conservative. Yet he contended that capitalism and the underlying adversarial relationship that often exists between workers and managers required fundamental reformation. And he saw this as part of that reformation. So in that particular campaign, $100,000 was very quickly raised from the managers and employees, and that was the bulk of the employees, supplemented by notes from a trust company and a note and mortgage from the New York Business Development Corporation. And that new company was organized as a public stock corporation authorized to issue 3,000 shares, 3,000 Class A common stock shares. And several months later, at the beginning of January 1976, an ESOP was created, which would establish accounts for all employees, including those who hadn't invested, and obviously including those who were rehired when the firm was saved. And remember that at that time, ESOPs were a new phenomenon. They'd only been written into federal legislation in 1974, so less than 2 years before that ESOP was created at the mill. My task was to conduct some longitudinal research in the form of questionnaires, interviews, and observation of practice, and to evaluate the short-term and medium-term impacts of this experiment, impacts on employee attitudes, satisfaction, motivation, and so forth, and to uncover objective indicators of performance. So I can say that after 12 months of the new ownership in this mill, perceptions of work satisfaction, of one's own efforts and colleagues' efforts, as well as concern over financial results, had increased significantly in a positive way. And objectively, less money was being spent on non-direct production personnel. So in other words, there was less need for supervision. The previous problems of pilfering, which had been an issue, things being taken out of the firm, had been eliminated. More attention was reported as being paid to wastage and fabric loss. There was a reduction in the cost of re-dyeing, which was a significant cost within a textile mill. And the voluntary quit rate had declined significantly. So some very positive results. But there are also some doubts about the durability of these positive improvements. I said that this was a longitudinal study, so there were questionnaires that were administered and interviews that were conducted in another 12 months after that. There were some of the perceptions of expected influence and actual influence over one's job, one's department, and the firm itself had become an increasingly pertinent issue. There were tensions felt by some, which I would define as a result of role ambiguity. You know, what is management's role? Is there a new expectation of our role as worker owners in this novel experiment? I should mention that the worker shareholders did participate in electing the board of directors, including 2 shop floor employees on the board. However, little else changed in everyday operational practice. The supervisors still supervised. So at least for a segment of the mill workers, after 2 years of the mill's history, for a segment of the mill workers, their raised expectations of some sort of change within the workplace had been dashed. And this actually was a common feature in all of the cases that we were studying. For example, I came across a quote in 1980, which was 4 years later, at the Herkimer furniture manufacturing plant. A quote from an individual who had been a former union local president, and he said, "We saved our jobs, yes, but it could have been a lot better. We thought things would be, well, different. We expected to be treated more like part owners with respect, not just as employees. The employees should have had a larger role than what they did have, but management just kind of pushed us to the side and said, quote, 'We're the boss and we're going to run the show,' unquote." And I might also point out that at the asbestos mine, something in the Northeast Kingdom, the Vermont Asbestos Group, something interesting happened, and that about the same period, 4 years later, the workers, the worker shareholders voted out their board, which they felt had made an investment decision that they hadn't been consulted on, and it turned out to be a very poor investment of their money. They voted out the board and sold their the bulk of the majority of ownership to a local businessman who they trusted more, and felt would run the plant in a more competent fashion than the previous management and board. So in that particular case, the fact of stock, the possession of stock, was used as a tool to further their interests. So you can see that people were struggling in these situations to try to understand their new roles. What did they expect of themselves? What did they expect of others of themselves? And it did lead to confusion, and it did lead to some level of distrust. So I think finally we could draw some lessons from these early cases. Again, 4 decades ago, remember, that these cases had promising attitudinal and productivity improvements. There's no doubt about that. But they also indicated struggles and tensions to shape the appropriate governance model within these new organizational forms. And I don't know whether that will be a theme that Doug picks up, but I'm going to hand over to Doug now to deal with the more recent cases.
Hello? No? Hello. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Very pleased to be here, and actually I'm really delighted to meet Michael. I've as an undergraduate, I was reading the studies that he was talking about, which were really, really important and influential in the development of the literature on employee ownership. I just have to say I was really happy to see Bernie Sanders as a surprise luncheon speaker. I was delighted, and in fact I rushed afterwards to meet him and tell him that I wanted to meet him because he had actually cited me and my research in one of his press releases. And he was very gracious. He said, well, did I summarize things right? And I said, yeah, sounded good to me. So I was very happy about that. My wife is going to be so jealous that I got to meet him. I have been studying employee ownership for several decades, not quite as long as Michael, but several decades. Actually, I started as an undergraduate. I studied one of the first ESOP companies in my senior thesis. My hair was brown at that time, and you can see my hair is gray now after several decades of studying employee ownership. So the only logical conclusion is that studying employee ownership turns your hair gray. That's the story I'm going to stick with. Let me just what I'd like to do is do just a really like 20-minute summary or so, and leave plenty of time for questions, discussion. I'd like to learn, what's on your mind, how your own experiences fit with what the research shows so far. So let me get myself positioned here. I think I've got to be able to see this thing so I know what I'm talking about. Good. So here's the structure of what I'm going to talk about. Why are we interested? 4 broad reasons. The current prevalence, research evidence on these 4 broad reasons: economic performance, economic stability and layoffs, employee pay, wealth and quality work life, inequality, the 2 big objections to employee ownership, and then implications for companies and policymakers. So, why are we interested? Employee ownership, I think one of the first things that when I mention I'm interested in employee ownership, people often say, oh, I bet that would make workers work harder. Well, that's kind of been the long-standing interest in this area, that employee ownership can affect economic performance, enhanced effort, cooperation, information sharing, commitment, turnover, and so forth, variety of means. Talk a little about the evidence about that in just a sec. A second area of interest is that employee ownership may increase economic stability and decrease unemployment by enhancing job security and company survival. A colleague of mine at UMass Amherst and I just published a big book on that last year. Third reason is the employee outcomes. It may affect employee pay and wealth, employee management relations, quality of work life. And finally, thinking more broadly, employee ownership may affect societal income and wealth distribution and generally broaden participation in the economic system. And that was actually the main motivation of Senator Long when he established ESOPs in ERISA in 1974. He wanted to broaden ownership generally, and that harks back, well, I'll talk about that. It harks back to a long theme in American politics. Okay, just a couple quick notes on the current prevalence. Most of the following stats are from the General Social Survey. It's done by the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago. It's a representative sample of adult Americans, conducted every 2 years. We were able to get questions put on this survey starting in 2002 with some generous support from the Employee Ownership Foundation and a few other sources. We've been able to do this every 4 years, 2002, 2006, 2010, 2014, and 2018. In fact, yeah, the interviews were done in May, so we're expecting to have the 2018 results, first look at them this fall. One quick look here. Back in 2002, we asked people, do you own any stock in your company? These are employees, not self-employed. And 2002, there was 20.1%. Dipped down in 2006, 17.1%. The big thing that happened in that time, of course, was Enron, which caused a lot of companies to be skittish, especially about employee ownership in 401k plans. So that's I think, the main culprit there. But employee ownership recovered since that time, back up to 19.5% in 2014. And of course, we'll see what the 2018 numbers are shortly. So about 1 in 5 workers, 1 in 5 employees own stock in their company. Another look is just at ESOPs. The previous slide was about all forms of employee ownership. This is just looking at ESOPs. 1999, 6.9% of the private sector workforce participated in ESOP, and that's gone up to 9.3% in 2012. We've got the 2000, just looking last week at the 2015 numbers. There's now 10.8 million ESOP participants, according to the most recent numbers from the DOL. But I haven't calculated that as a percent of the workforce yet. Still, the numbers keep going up. One interesting thing about employee ownership is people often think, well, this is going to be concentrated among particular types of employees, it's just for managers or just for professionals. And we do see that management and management-related occupations have slightly higher. But the really striking thing to me here is that employee ownership is pretty well spread out across all occupations. It's lowest in service, but 17% in blue-collar and agriculture. So that's the striking thing to me here is not the amount of variation, but to some extent the lack of variation. It's not all concentrated. And we see that when looking at industries too. It's particularly common in communication and information technologies, 46%, but again we see a good distribution across a whole range of industries. So, the source of interest number one is economic performance. Just a really quick kind of initial look here from the employee's perspective. We asked workers on our on the general social survey how, I forget the exact wording of the question, but basically how hard do your fellow workers work on a scale from 0 to 10. And employee owners gave figures of that were significantly higher than those of non-employee owners. So that's just a kind of initial look that from the employee perspective, they think their fellow workers are working harder. What does the research evidence show here? Well, there have been lots of studies. There have been over 100 studies using hard performance measures on productivity, profitability. And one of the things that that's very in vogue now is to do meta-analyses. Meta-analyses are where you combine the results of lots of different studies. And it's not just a literature review. You combine the results of lots of statistical studies and you do statistics on those combined results. You do a lot of statistical tests on the combined results. There's a wonderful meta-analysis that's just about to come out that's looked at 102 samples, almost 57,000 firms, found a positive small relation to hard performance measures, 4 to 5% higher productivity on average associated with employee ownership. And sometimes people say 4 to 5%. Well, that doesn't sound like much. Well, that's 2 to 3 years of productivity growth in the U.S. economy over the last few decades. There's similar results in pre-post comparisons of ESOP adopters. You often think, well, of course, maybe there's something else going on here. But if you follow these firms before and after they adopt employee ownership, the performance does go up. Similar results among small and large firms. One really interesting finding of this meta-analysis is that the positive effect has grown stronger over time. You might think that the early adopters are the ones who are going to gain the most from it, and that the later adopters wouldn't gain as much. But if anything, if you look at the companies have been adopting in the since 2000, they're getting bigger performance effects than the ones that were adopting back in the 80s and 90s. But, very important point here, and this won't be a surprise to any of you, there's a substantial dispersion in outcomes. Some firms do great, other firms don't. Say a little more about that. Results from workers also support positive performance effects. We did analysis of general social survey, also the National Bureau of Economic Research. We did surveys of over 40,000 employees. We also worked with the Great Place to Work Institute. They they generate that 100 best employers to work for, 100 best places to work, and we were able to get data on their underlying applications. We found that, and that's over 300,000 employees, we found that employee owners were less likely to look for other jobs, so lower turnover intention, and more likely to take action when coworkers are not working well. And I'll say more about that question in just a sec. But the effects do depend on other workplace policies. In all three data sets, employee ownership, I make my neck hurt here. I think, okay, as long as everyone can still see me. I remember psychology experiments from when I was an undergrad that people pay less attention when they can't physically see someone, that they remember less. So I always try to make sure all my students can see me, physically see me. In all three data sets, employee ownership and profit sharing are linked to policies of greater empowerment, employee involvement, training, job security, found positive correlations there. And there's an important interaction. They're linked to lower turnover and other favorable outcomes only when combined with those kind of policies, the involvement, training, job security. Got to present a graph here, of course. This graph shows that in companies with the low employee empowerment on the left, that have a lot of what we call shared capitalism, we're combining employee ownership and profit sharing and gain sharing plans. If they have high shared capitalism but low employee empowerment, the turnover rate 17.6%, and that's actual turnover rates as reported by the companies. But for high employee empowerment, it goes down to 6.3%. Whereas if there's no shared capitalism, no employee ownership, profit sharing, and so forth, that blue line there, it just stays up there around 14 or 15%. So that strongly indicates this interactive effect. What we think is happening. The increased productivity is not caused mainly by increased effort. It's not that people are sweating harder. One major factor is mutual monitoring by employees. And another major factor is low levels of supervision with greater employee discretion. Another major factor, lower turnover, better selection of workers. Better workers want you. Oh, I left out the slide on that, the working well. One of the really interesting findings from that survey of 40,000 employees was that we asked the question, this one I can remember, we worked long and hard on the wording of this. If you were to see a fellow worker not working as hard or well as he or she should, how likely would you be to talk to the worker, talk to a manager, talk about it in a work group, do nothing? All of those were separate, and people gave their ratings of their likelihood. And we found that very clearly people in our first few surveys said, yes, if they were employee owners, they would be more likely to do something, to talk to a worker who wasn't working well. So then in our later surveys, we asked, so why? And a lot of them did say they wanted to keep work standards high. They wanted to make sure people weren't free riders, that people weren't diminishing the value of their stock price or their profits. We'll talk a little more about free riding in a bit. So the second reason that people are interested in employee ownership, economic stability and layoffs. From the General Social Survey, they have a question about whether you were laid off last year. We find that the gray lines there are the non-employee owners. The dark ones are the employee owners. And in each year, the employee owners are much less likely to be laid off. So that's worker reported. Here's another fun graph. This comes from the book that I did with Gurdon at UMass Amherst. Our title is How Did Employee Ownership Firms Weather the Past Two Recessions? We tracked all publicly traded companies from 1999 through 2012 and found that these are the ESOP and non-ESOP companies. The red line there is the non-ESOP companies. And you can see there's a lot of variation. With the first recession, there's this big dip. It climbed back up, but then this really big dip again in 2008. Whereas the ESOP companies, you see dips, but not nearly as extreme. We did a variety of statistical tests here and found that in employee ownership companies, they had basically about half the layoffs of non-employee ownership companies. And I think that's a really big deal. That's a very important finding. If employee ownership is good, not just for the employees and the company, but also good for the economy as a whole. It helps stabilize the economy. Apart from stability, other research shows greater survival of employee ownership firms compared to similar non-employee ownership firms. Why the greater stability? One might think, well, there's more flexible compensation. We actually didn't find that at all. What we found was some pretty suggestive evidence that employee ownership firms retain workers to maintain an employee ownership culture and promote long-term productivity. It's hard to maintain an employee ownership culture when you're laying people off. Owners don't like to be laid off. I guess that's kind of obvious. Policy implications, as I say, fewer layoffs and greater survival help decrease unemployment and increase macroeconomic stability, creating positive externalities for economy and society that can justify supportive public policy. Kind of stuff that Bernie Sanders has been promoting. Okay, so employee outcomes. Several studies show employee ownership companies have higher total compensation levels. The employee ownership seems to come on top of regular compensation. ESOP firms generally do not cut base pay when adopting the ESOP. Base pay is stable or increasing despite occasional concessions. There were some people in our fellows program who did some marvelous research looking at all ESOP adoptions from 1980 through 2001. And despite the fact there were some concessions in that time, overall, the result was that the ESOPs came on top of the standard pay. ESOPs also add to employee wealth, not just substituting for other assets. How can this be? I'm an economist, and you present these kind of results to economists. They say, nope, sorry, don't believe it. Employee ownership has to come at the cost of something else. Why doesn't employee ownership substitute for wages or other benefits? Well, employee ownership may often function like what economists call an efficiency wage from economic theory. The cost of paying above market can be offset by attracting better workers, decreasing turnover, discouraging shirking, increasing morale. So employee ownership may increase worker performance if on top of standard wages and benefits, but have no effect if used as a wage substitute. And in fact, you may even get a bad reaction. We have some results suggesting that. If it's a substitute, workers react badly. They just see it as a shift of financial risk rather than empowerment. Okay, you're going to give me some employee ownership as just cutting into my wages. Big deal. That's just more risk for me. Other employee outcomes. Employee owners are more likely to be in employee involvement teams where workers make decisions, so it tends to go along with employee involvement. They're also more likely to receive company-sponsored training. And just a few other findings here from a variety of studies. They're more likely to report better views of management-employee relations, that the company is fair to all employees, coworkers can be relied on for help, and greater job security, which obviously fits with the layoff data. And one interesting finding, that they report higher job satisfaction, but only if combined with other high-performance policies, the empowerment policies, training, job security, employee involvement, pay at or above market. In fact, if you don't have those things, and you have employee ownership, satisfaction may suffer a bit. Maybe it's just seen as a form of financial risk sharing. Okay, and the last source of interest, economic inequality. Productivity has been going up over the last 50, 60 years. but most workers haven't benefited from the productivity gains since the 1970s. That top line there is the productivity line, and the blue line is the hourly compensation of non-supervisory workers. And we see that those lines diverge in the late 70s. That's just barely trickled up. And of course, this feeds into the inequality that we hear a lot about and that Bernie talks a lot about.
Before we move ahead, this is a fascinating graph because, previous one, just going back to the cases I explained we were looking at, the buyouts through the Cornell program. This is precisely when you started to see a plateau, a flattening out in that hourly wage compensation.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, where have those productivity gains gone? Disproportionately to those with high incomes. This graph actually goes all the way back to 1913. Looking at the that top blue line is the top 1% average income adjusted for inflation, and you can see that skyrockets since 1990, whereas the bottom green line, bottom 90% average income, just has gone up very, very little. So those productivity gains are primarily going to the people at the top. Now I'm not here to bash people in the top 1%, but just stating it as kind of a basic fact that is where the productivity gains have been going in the past couple decades. Other evidence shows part of the growth of inequality is due to a shift in favor of capital income at the expense of labor income. And capital income is more concentrated than labor income. The shift to capital income is unlikely to change soon. Thomas Piketty got a lot of attention a couple of years back talking about this big shift from labor income to capital income. So, one idea we have is that perhaps workers should get more of that capital income. Can employee ownership and profit sharing play a role here, tempering inequality through broader access to capital ownership and income for middle and lower classes? As I mentioned, that was a key motivation for Senator Long in ERISA. And Richard Freeman, our colleague at Harvard, actually my dissertation advisor, he makes a fun argument. He says, who owns the robots rules the world. By robots, he's talking about all kinds of technology. He says, we need broader capital ownership, and workers need to own the robots that are increasingly taking their jobs. We hear a lot of worry about technological unemployment. Well, if workers are going to lose jobs, it'd be nice if they owned the technology that they were losing the jobs to, so they would still have some income and help avoid more of a two-tiered society. Okay, two key issues. One is the free rider problem. I think most everyone's heard that. When I first went to illustrate the free rider problem, I thought, let me look around on the internet and find a picture of a bicycle built for two, and thought that'd be just a fun way to illustrate the problem. Look at what I found. I found this picture of a bicycle built for 10, and this looks like, I don't have it dated, but it looks like it's from around 1900, maybe even late 1800s. 10 guys there, all in a row, and you have to believe that the free rider temptation is really strong for that guy at the very end. I mean, who's going to know whether he's biking or not? Knowing that, the 9th guy may figure, well, the 10th guy isn't going to be working, I'm not going to be working either. And then the 8th guy may think that, and so forth. It may end up with the first guy doing all the work and not knowing how much the guys behind him are doing. The other big complaint, the other big objection is risk aversion. Got a picture here of a guy in bed, cowering in bed. James never left his bed, seen nothing but danger in the financial world. So what are the responses to that? Well, the free rider problem, we find productivity is generally higher in employee ownership firms, which kind of goes against the free rider problem right off the bat. As shown earlier, a study of over 40,000 worker reports finds workers co-monitoring helps overcome the incentive to free ride. Workers with a greater stake in performance monitor each other more closely and are more willing to take action against shirkers. And as I mentioned before, such efforts seem to work best with other high-performance empowerment policies and practices. Training, job security, employee involvement, pay at or above market level. What about the risk aversion problem? That's one that economists tend to worry a lot about. Excessive risk is a danger, and I'm a very risk-averse person myself. We found several interesting things. Even among the most risk-averse, over 4,000 employees surveyed, that should say 40,000, it's a typo there. We found that 2/3 want at least some ownership, profit sharing, or stock options in their pay package. So even really risk-averse workers seem to like these types of pay. As I mentioned before, these plans tend to come back on top of market-level pay and benefits, which greatly reduces risk since workers are not sacrificing fixed pay. A big point, I think, is the biggest financial risk faced by most workers is that you're going to lose your job. And the study that Fadon and I and several other studies show suggests that employee owners are less likely to lose their jobs. So that greatly mitigates the financial risk. Finally, Harry Markowitz is a Nobel Prize winner for portfolio theory. And my colleague Joseph Blasi contacted him some years back, I guess 10 years ago or so, with interest in this. And Harry became very interested in this. He rejects the idea that risk aversion condemns employee ownership. And he worked on this and developed theory, published some theory, concluding that workers can prudently have 10 to 15% of their assets in employee ownership if the rest of their household wealth portfolio is well diversified. And I should emphasize, this is 10 to 15% of family wealth, not 10 to 15% of the company owned by workers. This is 10 to 15% of their personal wealth in employee ownership. So, implications for companies and policymakers. For companies, employee ownership can improve performance, commitment, retention, innovation, excuse me. But the company can't just install a plan and expect an automatic positive effect. And I think that's drives very much with what Michael was saying about those early case studies, that you can't just give people stock and expect a magical effect. And that's no surprise to any of you in the employee ownership companies, I'm sure. And it may even be harmful if employees just see it as attempting to shift financial risk without giving employees discretion and skills to improve performance. It's like the message, we want you to work harder because you own stock, but we're still going to look over your shoulder every minute. Just a list of some of the things to maximize the value of employee ownership. Again, this won't be a surprise to many of you. The policies can include employee involvement, information sharing, training, selective recruitment, fewer levels of hierarchy, lower levels of supervision, more job security, basically more responsibility and skills for workers. For policymakers, the United States has a rich history of supporting broadened ownership going back to the Founding Fathers. We wrote about this in our book, The Citizen's Share, that came out a few years ago. It goes all the way back to George Washington, his first, I can't resist saying, his first big economic development legislation was to establish tax incentives, basically, tax incentives to rebuild the cod fishing fleet. Cod fishing fleet had been decimated by the British during the Revolutionary War. It basically functioned as the Navy for the revolutionaries, and the British decimated that. Well, Washington wanted to rebuild it. At first he said, okay, we'll give tax incentives to the owners. The sailors said, wait a minute, the tradition in this industry is that everyone shares in the catch. Everyone, we do broad sharing. And so with the support of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and others, they reconstituted the tax incentives so that 5/8 of the tax incentive would go directly to the workers, to be shared among the workers, and a company to receive the tax incentive, the shipbuilder had to establish a profit-sharing plan for the workers. So there's a really rich history of broadened economic rewards going back to the Founding Fathers. We, in our book, of course, we talk about a variety of policies now to increase broad-based sharing, from low-cost ideas, commissions, and the bully pulpit, to more aggressive approaches, restructuring tax incentives. We do run a national fellowship program created in 2008, more than 100 fellows to date, where we meet twice a year. Most are junior scholars, with senior professors from many universities as faculty mentors. Joseph says he wanted to create a cottage industry in employee ownership research. And I think we've done a good job of that. The Kelso Workshop, supported by John Menke and the Employee Ownership Foundation every January. Beister Symposium, it's going to happen in a couple weeks here, supported by the Employee Ownership Foundation, Foundation for Enterprise Development, every June. And we've got a growing number of young scholars who are now tenured around the country. This is my last slide, although I want to say one thing after this. When I was looking around for that picture of the bicycle built for 2, I found this really interesting picture of a bicycle built for 7. But it's a special one made by Hammacher Schlemmer. This is not an advertisement. I'm not getting any kickbacks here. The riders all face each other. It's one where there's only one person steering. I believe that person at the extreme right there is doing the steering, but everyone is pedaling, and everyone can see each other, and they can see who's exerting effort. So I thought, this is kind of a neat metaphor for the 21st century workplace. And in fact, this is used in team building exercises, at corporate retreats, things like that. But I thought this was a really nice metaphor for the 21st century workplace, where so much is done in teamwork, and people can see how each other are doing. I have to admit, I also, at the time I got this picture, I couldn't resist finding out how much this thing cost. It costs, at that time, it was $18,000, and I went to my dean and said, "We really need this, don't we?" And he just laughed. I don't know, I don't think he took me too seriously. So that's all my slides. I do want to mention one more thing. As I mentioned, we did this big series of surveys of over 40,000 employees that just produced a wealth of information, a wealth of studies. We want to create we're now in the process of creating the next generation of ESOP studies. We're talking to a number of ESOP companies. Would love to talk to any of you about doing a new survey. We've got right now Jung from Rutgers. Oh, there he is. Is one of our research fellows from Rutgers, and he's coordinating this. This survey, a lot of the previous surveys just look at like 1 or 2 issues, like ESOP satisfaction, or employee commitment, or turnover, or something like that. And in this survey, we're trying to cover a whole range of things. So that makes it, I should say right up front, that makes it a bit longer than most surveys. Generally, we try to have surveys be 20 to 25 minutes. This one's more like 35 to 40 minutes, but that's because it has a wealth of information, a wealth of questions in it, and we think it's a really good investment for companies. Of course, we'll provide all kinds of feedback to companies that participate in this if we can survey your employees, and provide all kinds of comparisons to other companies, and see what seems to work best in helping employee outcomes and performance, and as I say, just a whole range of things we're studying. So it's meant to be a very rich and powerful study. Okay.
I must say that I'm envious when I think of the amount of data that you do have to work with now, and obviously the facility to garner data compared to those very intensive case studies that I was doing. However, I think that some of the elements we gleaned out of those experiences reflected in terms of continuity in some of the larger themes on that canvas that you're that you've presented to us. So I'd like to have people involved and direct questions this way to Doug on any element of his research, especially if you think part of any of those themes reflects or is helpful in helping you understand what's happening in your particular enterprise. Questions? Yeah.
So the question I was expecting to see data that showed the performance comparing employee-owned companies versus non-employee-owned companies in terms of return on investment, things like that. I was curious, could you speak to that? And particularly, it would be interesting to see that data for firms that are in similar business, the same kind of business.
I'm sorry, similar.
Doing the same thing.
The same thing, right. Okay, no, that's a great question. And among those over 100 studies, that is the standard practice to compare it to firms in the same industry. And a lot of the studies, particularly the early studies, are cross-sectional ones that do basically, just comparing employee ownership to non-employee ownership in the same industry at the same time. But increasingly, a wide range of studies use the panel data where they are able to do before-after comparisons. Really, the ideal comparison is to do a before-after comparison for a company adopting an ESOP, say, and compare that to the same non-ESOP company that didn't adopt an ESOP in the same industry. So that's really the state of the art, is to do really careful controls both before and after, and combine that with looking at firms in the same industry. A lot of those studies have dealt with return on investment, return on assets, and one of the things I've done in past presentations, maybe I should do it here, is to put up a picture, put up another graph showing that the performance jumping up on average, and what seems to happen is that the performance, when you adopt an ESOP, it jumps up on average and gets basically to a new plateau at a higher level. It doesn't necessarily increase the productivity growth rate, but increases the level, and that higher level is maintained. But yeah, a lot of these studies have looked at return on assets, return on investment, and so forth, and that's, I just referred to the meta-analysis, but didn't go into the detail there.
I have a question about one of the variables that we hear you talking about, and that is how much debt is held by the ESOP for the company. If that degree of economic headwind against profitability is a factor at all in the difference between employee-owned and non-employee-owned.
No, that's an interesting question. No, that the studies really haven't looked at the amount of debt, comparing the leveraged and non-leveraged ESOPs, for example. No, we should look at that.
Just because I wonder if there is more incentive in an ESOP, more incentive created by an ESOP that doesn't have to have so much of the company's earnings used to pay down debt.
Okay.
And if there were lower debt, then the unit of extra work would return a much greater unit of profit.
You're putting it back in your pocket rather than in the bank's pocket. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's a great question. I'll follow up on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have the data or the interest in looking at any of the survey results by generation or by tenure of employment? I've noticed that the millennial generation of employees tend to move more frequently among jobs and not tend to stay long enough to reap the value of ESOPs in a financial sense, and I'm wondering how that affects their kind of investment in the productivity.
Yeah, that another great question. The studies haven't, to my knowledge, haven't specifically compared the different generations. The studies typically control for tenure, and as a basic control variable there, and find that not surprisingly, with more tenure, workers build up larger balances, and the larger balances can be an important influence there. With regard to the millennials, though, I think it's interesting. It's very common for people to say, well, millennials are all job hopping a lot more than used to happen. I'm not sure that's true. There's actually some economic research in the past couple years showing that people, compared to, say, the early 90s, are more likely to stay at their company. The proportion of people who have stayed at their company for more than 10 years or more than 20 years has actually gone up. Now, job hopping is very common among people in their 20s. That's been known for a long time, that people, young folks, tend to do a lot of job shopping, as labor economists refer to it, trying to find out where their skills can be used best and what kind of job interests them the most. But that's been happening a long time, and I'm not, as I say, it's a very commonplace thing to say millennials are all, there's no commitment now, but I think that may have been true of us oldsters as well. But the question of how this may tie into millennial values, we've got a couple of fellows who are looking at this, seeing if millennials value something differently than us oldsters, us people with gray hair, and I think that's a really interesting question.
Someone else in there.
Yeah, well, I just had a question if you were looking at co-ops too, because a lot of what you have been referred to, even in the studies that you're doing, are all on ESOPs. Are you finding the same data as across the board with worker cooperatives as well?
Yeah, so some of the, I've referred to ESOPs several times. Some of the, a number of the studies deal with ESOPs, but a number of those studies deal with cooperatives as well. And we've got several fellows in our national fellowship program who are focused on co-ops. We actually have one person who's now a professor at the University of Pittsburgh who did just a marvelous study comparing a high-tech engineering cooperative in the Midwest, doing an intensive case study with all kinds of great measurement, and comparing it to a very similar non-cooperative high-tech engineering company in the Midwest. And it was just a masterful dissertation, looking at the dynamics and how workers, he was able to really get into it in a big way and look at how workers relate to each other and how they take responsibility or don't take responsibility and so forth. So, yeah, most of the, well, yeah, I guess that's the basic answer, is that those employee ownership studies include all forms of employee ownership. It's probably a little more heavily weighted to ESOP studies, but it's all forms of employee ownership.
Questions, Chris?
Doug, I mean, the evidence is strong that this is a really good thing, right? And you talked about the externalities, and I don't know, maybe you can shed some light on that, but I think the savings to government with unemployment, et cetera, are pretty significant. Is there anybody doing some serious work on the policy side? I mean, at the VOC, we're going to have a retreat here in a couple of weeks, and it's like we're trying to bend that curve, and what can be done from a policy side, or is anybody working on that to drive more employee ownership?
I'm so glad you asked. Yes, I think there's been a lot more policy interest just in the past couple years. And in fact, several of our fellows that we've funded are in policy circles, including both on the Democratic and Republican side. There's strong interest. One of the really interesting things about employee ownership, and this I'm sure won't be a surprise to many of you, is that it really has a lot of support from across the ideological spectrum. And so we've been supporting fellows across the ideological spectrum. We're working on policy side. But I also have to say that Joseph and I have been very happy that we've worked in the past boy, just in the past 6 months, I think we've worked with 4 different U.S. senators' offices on an employee ownership legislation that they are introducing. And I shouldn't mention the names, but it probably won't be a surprise when you see somebody come out with something on employee ownership. Joseph and I have been providing some help on that. So I think it really has attracted attention. Bernie, of course, has been supporting this for a long time, but there's a lot of interest among senators, some with presidential aspirations, who who see this as a kind of a really, I won't say new approach, but a kind of approach that's not been considered enough in policy circles, and they want to push this hard. So I actually think there is the potential for some real policy movement on this in the next couple of years.
So, we don't have to do this now, but I'd love to get the names of the fellows that are kind of in those policy circles and
Oh, sure.
see what they're thinking about, in the future. We've got some stuff that's going to make a little difference now, but
Absolutely. Yeah, be glad to.
Another question that is, can you articulate what those pieces of legislation are about? What specifically they are that are proposed?
Well, actually, I'm not sure I can articulate all there's a bill that's been introduced that in both the Senate and the House that really does a lot to basically clean up SBA regulations so that SBA will be much more supportive. Actually, you're probably a better source on this than I am on the details. So there's that's one approach. There's also one of the ideas that Bernie and others have pushed is to establish state employee ownership centers. Vermont and Ohio are the 2 states, some of you may know about this, Vermont and Ohio are the 2 states that are way out ahead in terms of the employee ownership centers. And one of the ideas that Bernie has proposed and several other senators have signed on to is providing seed money so that each state in the country gets $1 million or $2 million to set up centers like this. That could be a real support. There are a bunch of other ideas. One of the ideas that we put in our book, The Citizens Share, that was actually in a piece of legislation that Tammy Baldwin introduced, is to basically to treat incentive plans the same way that pension plans are treated, to only give tax deductibility if they're broad-based. A lot of executives get very nice stock options, bonuses, all that kind of stuff, and those are tax deductible. Well, certainly the bonuses are. Stock options get a little trickier, but bonuses, restricted stock tends to be tax deductible for the company. One of our ideas was, okay, why don't we treat that the way that ERISA treats pensions? That can only be tax deductible if a similar plan is available to all employees. If you want to, give big bonuses to your execs, fine, you can do it, but it should only be tax deductible if every employee has access to a similar plan. And that really harks back to the George Washington's idea with the cod fishing fleet, as I said, that the tax incentives have to be shared in a broad-based way. So that's one of the other ideas that's been proposed, and I'm sure there's others I could go into, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Yes.
Just a little bit different angle. I'm wondering, since you're both professors, is there a push or a drive, and now that you've got so much, quite a bit of data and research, to introduce this, and is it being introduced at least college level as a study for students, particularly in the economic field, but maybe generally student body. Is that coming about?
I'm glad you raised that. You're entirely right. That's one of the things we want to make sure of. The Beister Foundation that's given us a lot of support. They some years ago they supported setting up a a special segment of the case place at the Aspen Institute, a special segment that would be devoted to employee ownership case studies that can get used by teachers. And recently, just about a year and a half ago, that got transferred to Rutgers. It's called CLEO, C-L-E-O, the Curriculum Library on Employee Ownership. Just talking to Cecile about this earlier. And we've got right now about 750 or so case studies there that are designed to be teaching material. And we really want to, we're still getting a few of the technical glitches out, but want to make sure that that becomes widely available so that it can get introduced, so that you know, a sophomore or junior business student who's interested, you know, got some good ideas for going into business, they can run across this idea of employee ownership and say, hey, maybe this is something I should pursue. So that is a big push of ours, that we really want to do that, and I'm glad you raised that.
Yeah, and I've looked at that inventory. Well, I mean, I've spent a couple of hours looking at it, and yeah, it looks very useful. It's got a lot of cases in it that can be material for classes and for lecturers to use in their modules, as well as articles that have been published and other manuscripts. And if I can just expand on what Doug said, yeah, we have an initiative coming out of our board from our last strategic planning get together last June, in which we're beginning to contact interested faculty at institutes of higher education in the state to encourage them to use this kind of material or contact us for the course curricula that have already been developed around the country by folks at Rutgers and an advisor, and which can be used in new courses that they're developing. So we're hoping to be able to do that more effectively.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. And I should say, I mentioned case studies. It's not just, case studies, but it's syllabi, and it's a wide range of teaching materials. It includes the, things like the film We the Owners, an hour-long film that's just a marvelous case study of depiction of 3 employee ownership companies and the different challenges they face. My wife, Lisa, is also a Rutgers professor, and she taught a course where she showed that film, and the students really liked the fact that one of the companies that's featured in that We the Owners is New Belgium Brewing, which does the Fat Tire beer. So you mentioned beer to college students, and they, hey, that sounds good. That looks like fun. Yeah, employee ownership and beer. What could get better?
Stand up with the
Yeah.
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, you have.
I just, in recent months, as I approach selling my company to the workers, I've been looking online, trying to find academic research and different things, and I came across Eleanor Ostrom, and she seemed like kind of a champion or a hero in academia around not so much the technical aspects, but like the philosophically, the idea of the commons. And I was just wondering if she's like a influence for you guys, or if you think of her, where she relates to like the work you do, or if you've ever studied her, or is she relevant, or just...
I'm not, I haven't met her, so...
Yeah, no, she's great. I like her work a lot. This is terrible. I can't remember if she's been at our last couple of conferences, but we're definitely but she's in our orbit. But no, I'm sorry. Oh, then she hasn't been at our last couple. I'm becoming an absent-minded professor here, but we absolutely know of her work. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it is a small field, but it's expanding pretty rapidly, and it's very interdisciplinary. We have. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it pulls in. I'm more a sociologist and social psychologists and
we've even had.
Cultural anthropologists.
we've had political theorists. We've even had some religion scholars as part of this, exploring the aspects there. So yes, we're very interested in the broad range.
Thank you.
For my part, I guess I'd just like to close the circle with going back to my earlier remarks. I indicated to the group that from those case studies, there were failings, and as a research scientist, I think the best of us are just as interested in failures as in success. Successes tend to be promoted, but we learn just as much from failure. And I said that those early, really all of those early buyouts suffered from confusion ultimately in role definition as a result of the change in ownership and the devolution of ownership into the workplace. So has there been, I mean, again, probably I should be talking more to a social psychologist or a sociologist looking into these issues, but I was just wondering if you were familiar with folks who are looking at and beginning to address this particular question, because it has to do with successful democratization of these workplaces, and how particularly the non-managerial owner role is defined and put into practice on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and we do have psychologists and others trying to get inside workers' heads, figure out what's going on. Actually, one of the I mentioned this next generation ESOP survey we're doing. One of the segments is several questions to measure psychological ownership, looking at looking at the extent to which
So, when I began to analyze in more minute detail the responses to, particularly in the second year survey, it became clear to me that the psychological ownership or de facto ownership was every bit as important as de jure ownership.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you own a property but you don't use it, then you lose it. And in fact, that's indeed what happened in very real cases. People gave up their shares, or they sold out to a potential buyer coming in from the outside. That happened in a number of these cases. So it's very important that management understand that you've got to give workers a feeling that in fact they do own the place, as well as having those de jure rights. It's got to be practiced. It's got to be put into effect. They've got to feel like owners.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. After all these hundreds of studies have been done, you come up with a pretty obvious conclusion that employee ownership isn't going to mean much unless workers get to feel like owners, unless you treat people like owners. And if you don't, then it's just another financial risk or just nothing. Got to make a difference in the daily work lives.
Time for just a quick question.
Yeah, quick one. Yeah.
Quick here, but can you tell us about the Rutgers Institute and what the hopes and aspirations of that will be, I guess, in a 60-second?
Yeah, 60 seconds, sure. We just we've got a variety of activities going on at Rutgers to support employee ownership. We've done, Joseph and I in particular, have done a lot of work over the years on it, and we've got the library going. We've got the New York, New Jersey Center for Employee Ownership, nothing like what the Vermont one is now. I would be delighted if we can get that to this size in a couple of years. So we have a variety of initiatives, but we didn't have we wanted an all-encompassing institution, and we created, just a couple months ago, the Rutgers University approved our creation of the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, which is the first institute in the world devoted to this, in recognition of all the work we've done in this area. And it's meant to be a kind of high-profile collection point for the research, for the outreach, for the library, for our policy work too. We want to, as we talk to senators and others about policies. We will have the resources of the Institute to back us up. And the Employee Ownership Foundation, again, has been a big supporter of that, which we immensely appreciate.
Okay, well, time's up. Thanks for coming. I hope you learned something in the process. And thanks, Doug.